What if everything you were taught about purpose, your career, your goals, your dreams, what if all of it was just a comforting story? Think about it for a moment. You wake up every morning. You chase progress. You chase success. You chase meaning. But what if the universe never promised you any of those things? What if the universe is completely silent? No grand plan, no cosmic script, no hidden purpose waiting to be discovered. Just existence. For most people, this thought is terrifying, because if life has no inherent meaning, then why wake up tomorrow? Why struggle? Why work? Why continue living at all? This exact question haunted one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, Albert Camus. In his famous philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus made a shocking claim. He said, "There is only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." At first, that statement sounds extreme. But Camus wasn't glorifying despair. He was asking the most honest question a human being can ask. If life has no ultimate meaning, why should we keep living? Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this question. They distract themselves with work, with entertainment, with social media, with endless goals and achievements. But sometimes, something happens. A moment, a realization, a quiet thought that appears in your mind late at night. And suddenly you ask yourself, why am I doing all of this? What is the point of any of it? And once that question enters your mind, it changes everything. Because once you see the truth that Albert Camus was pointing to, you can never completely unsee it. But here's the strange part. Camus believed this realization doesn't destroy your life. It actually has the power to set you free. And to understand why, we first need to understand the invisible illusion that gives most people their sense of meaning. Because the truth is, much of the meaning people believe in was quietly built for them by society, the illusion of meaning society gives us. From the moment you're born, a story about your life quietly begins to form. No one announces it directly. No one sits you down and says, "Here is the script you must follow." But somehow, everyone seems to know it. You go to school, you get good grades, you build a career, you make money, you find love, you buy a house, you build a family. And if you do all of these things correctly, you're supposed to feel fulfilled, supposed to feel like your life has meaning. But have you ever noticed something strange? Millions of people follow this exact script and still feel empty. They reach the career they once dreamed about. They achieve the success they worked years for. They build the life society told them to chase. Yet late at night, when everything becomes quiet, a strange question appears in their mind. Is this really it? This isn't a new problem. Philosophers have been noticing this pattern for centuries. For example, Friedrich Nietzsche warned that as traditional belief systems weaken, people would begin to experience what he called a crisis of meaning. He famously declared that God is dead, but he didn't mean it literally. What he meant was that the old structures that once gave people a clear sense of purpose were slowly collapsing. Religion, tradition, community. For thousands of years, these systems answered life's biggest questions. Why are we here? What should we do? What gives life value? But in the modern world, those answers started to fade, and suddenly, people were left alone with the question. Not long after, another philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, pushed this idea even further. He argued that human beings are condemned to be free. In other words, there is no universal rulebook for life, no predetermined meaning. We exist first, and only later try to define who we are. At first, this sounds empowering, but psychologically, it can also feel terrifying, because if no higher system guarantees meaning, then the responsibility falls entirely on you. And most people are not prepared for that responsibility, so society builds psychological safety nets. Career status becomes meaning. Money becomes meaning. Social approval becomes meaning. Even relationships sometimes become meaning. These things aren't bad by themselves, but they can quietly become substitutes for deeper questions. Questions like, who am I really? Why am I alive? What makes a life truly worth living? Most people stay busy enough to never face those questions. But eventually, something disrupts the illusion. Sometimes it's failure. Sometimes it's loss. Sometimes it's loneliness. And sometimes it's something much stranger. Success. You finally achieve the thing you spent years chasing, and instead of fulfillment, you feel an uncomfortable emptiness. That moment is what Albert Camus believed many people eventually experience. The moment when the comforting structure of meaning begins to crack. The moment when you realize that the answers society gave you might not actually answer the deeper question. And when that realization arrives, you encounter something that Camus believed defines the entire human condition. Something he called the absurd. And once you encounter it, you can never see life the same way again. At some point in life, something unusual happens. A moment that feels small on the surface, but quietly changes the way you see everything. You're sitting alone at night, driving home after a long day, walking through a crowded city, and suddenly a strange thought appears in your mind. Not a dramatic thought, not even a loud one. Just a quiet question. What is the point of all of this? For most people, that question disappears quickly. They check their phone. They turn on a show. They distract themselves with something else. But sometimes the question stays. And when it stays long enough, it begins to grow. The routine of life starts to feel strange. You wake up, go to work, complete tasks, chase goals, repeat the same pattern again and again. And one day you suddenly step outside the routine and notice something unsettling. All of this activity, all of this movement, but toward what? This is the moment Albert Camus described as the beginning of the absurd. In his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus explained that the absurd is born from a simple conflict. Human beings desperately want life to make sense. We want answers. We want a purpose. We want the universe to tell us that our existence matters. But when we ask the universe these questions, we receive silence. No explanation, no clear purpose. Just the vast, indifferent reality of existence. This clash between our desire for meaning and the universe's silence is what Camus called the absurd condition of life. And once you recognize it, something strange happens. The world begins to feel different. Things that once seemed obvious start to feel uncertain. The routines you followed without thinking now feel mechanical. The goals you were chasing suddenly seem questionable. You start asking deeper questions. Why am I pursuing this career? Why do I care so much about other people's opinion? Why do I spend so much of my life trying to prove something? These questions don't come from depression. They come from awareness. Awareness that the structure you once trusted may not be as solid as it seemed. This awakening can happen in many different ways. Sometimes it arrives through loss. You lose someone you love, and suddenly the fragility of life becomes undeniable. Sometimes it arrives through failure. A dream collapses, and you realize how much of your identity was built on it. Sometimes it arrives through loneliness. You find yourself surrounded by people, yet feeling strangely disconnected from everything. But the most unexpected trigger of existential awakening is something many people never talk about. Success. You achieve the goal you spent years pursuing. The promotion, the money, the recognition, and instead of feeling fulfilled, you feel something else. A quiet emptiness. A realization that the thing you believed would give life meaning didn't actually answer the deeper question. This is the moment Camus believed many people encounter the absurd for the first time. And once you see it, you can't completely return to the old illusion, because now you understand something unsettling. Life may not come with a built-in meaning, but here's where Camus becomes different from many philosophers. He didn't believe this realization should lead to despair. Instead, he believed it forces every person to face a choice. a choice that defines how they respond to the absurd. And according to Albert Camus, when people confront the possibility that life has no inherent meaning, they usually take one of three very different paths. Once a person truly confronts the possibility that life has no inherent meaning, something inside them shifts, because at that moment, the comfortable story they were living inside begins to fall apart. And when that happens, the mind desperately looks for a way to respond. According to Albert Camus, people usually take one of three psychological paths when they encounter the absurd, and the path they choose quietly shapes the rest of their life. The first path is the most common. 1. Escape through distraction. Most people never fully face the question of meaning, not because they're incapable of thinking about it, but because it feels uncomfortable. So instead of confronting the absurd, they escape it. They fill their lives with constant activity. More work, more entertainment, more noise, social media, endless scrolling, binge-watching shows, chasing money, chasing status, chasing validation. None of these things are inherently bad, but they can become something else. A way to avoid silence, a way to avoid asking the deeper question. As long as life stays busy, the question never has space to grow. But sometimes the distraction fades. And when it does, the question returns, which leads to the second response. 2. Philosophical escape. This response is more subtle. Instead of distracting themselves from the absurd, some people attempt to solve it by creating an answer, a belief system, a higher explanation, a story that restores meaning to the universe. This is what Camus called philosophical suicide, not physical suicide, but the act of abandoning honest questioning in exchange for comforting certainty. One philosopher who took a different approach was Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard believed that when rational answers fail, a person should take what he called a leap of faith, a conscious decision to believe in meaning beyond logic. For Kierkegaard, faith resolved the crisis, but Albert Camus disagreed. He believed that inventing meaning to escape the absurd was another form of avoidance. Instead of confronting reality, it replaces uncertainty with belief. And Camus wanted something far more honest. Which brings us to the third path, the rarest one. 3. Acceptance of the absurd. This path requires something most people find difficult: the courage to accept that life may not have a predetermined meaning, no cosmic purpose, no ultimate explanation waiting at the end of the road. At first, this realization can feel terrifying, because without a predetermined meaning, the structure that once guided life disappears. But Camus believed something surprising happens when a person fully accepts this truth. The moment you stop searching for a universal meaning, the rules that once limited you begin to disappear. You no longer have to live according to someone else's script. You no longer have to chase a life that society defined for you, and suddenly something unexpected appears. Freedom. But this isn't ordinary freedom. It's something far more radical. The freedom that comes from realizing that if life has no predetermined meaning, then the responsibility and the power to create meaning belongs entirely to you. And that realization, according to Camus, changes everything. When most people first hear the idea that life has no inherent meaning, their immediate reaction is fear. It sounds like the ground beneath your feet has disappeared. No cosmic plan, no predetermined purpose, no universal reason explaining why you exist. At first, this realization feels like chaos, but Albert Camus believed something very different happens once you move past the initial shock. Something powerful, something most people never realize. Because if life truly has no predetermined meaning, then something else must also be true. There is no script you are required to follow, no cosmic authority deciding what your life must look like, no universal checklist defining success, purpose, or fulfillment, which means something extraordinary. You are free, not the small, everyday kind of freedom, not just the freedom to choose what career you want or where you want to live. Camus was talking about something deeper, Radical freedom, the freedom that appears when you realize that the rules you believed were absolute were often created by society, culture, or expectation. Think about it. Many of the pressures people feel every day come from invisible scripts. The pressure to achieve success by a certain age, the pressure to prove your worth through status or wealth, the pressure to build a life that looks impressive from the outside. But if the universe never actually demanded any of these things, then why do they control so many lives? This is where Camus' thinking begins to overlap with another existential philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre famously said that existence precedes essence. In simple terms, this means something profound. Human beings are not born with a fixed purpose. We simply exist first, and only later begin defining who we are through our choices. At first glance, this can feel overwhelming, because if meaning isn't predetermined, then responsibility shifts directly onto you. Your choices matter more. Your actions define your life. Your decisions shape the meaning you experience. But Camus believed this realization can also dissolve some of the fears that quietly control people's lives. For example, the fear of failure. If life has no predetermined meaning, then failure loses much of its power. Failure no longer means you have ruined your purpose. It simply becomes another experience, another step in the process of living. The same is true for the fear of judgment. When you stop believing that life must follow a universal script, the opinions of others begin to lose their authority, because they are simply following their own interpretations of meaning, not absolute truth. And perhaps most importantly, this realization challenges one of the deepest anxieties people carry, the fear of wasting their life. Many people live with a quiet pressure inside them, a fear that they might choose the wrong path, the wrong career, the wrong lifestyle, the wrong direction. But if life was never designed with a single correct path, then the idea of a wrong life becomes far less meaningful. Instead of trying to discover a hidden purpose, you are free to create one. And this is exactly where Albert Camus takes his philosophy to its most powerful conclusion. Because once you recognize this radical freedom, the real question is no longer, what is the meaning of life? The real question becomes something far more interesting. How will you choose to live, knowing that meaning is yours to create? And Camus believed the answer to that question requires something bold, something defiant, something he called rebellion. After realizing that life has no inherent meaning, and after recognizing the radical freedom that comes with that realization, a new question emerges. If the universe offers no purpose, how should a person actually live? This is where the philosophy of Albert Camus becomes truly powerful. Because Camus rejected both despair and escape, he believed there was a third response, a response he called rebellion. But this isn't rebellion in the traditional sense. It's not about anger. It's not about chaos. And it's not about rejecting life. It's about defying meaninglessness by living fully anyway. Think about what this means. The universe may not promise meaning, but you still wake up. You still experience the world. You still feel joy, pain, curiosity, love, struggle. Life continues unfolding moment by moment. Camus believed the most honest response to the absurd is to embrace this experience completely, without pretending the universe owes you an explanation. To understand this idea, Camus used a powerful symbol from Greek mythology, the story of Sisyphus. According to the myth, Sisyphus was punished by the gods for his defiance. His punishment was cruel and endless. He was forced to push a massive boulder up a mountain. Every time he reached the top, the rock would roll back down, and he had to begin again, over and over, for eternity. At first glance, this story feels like the perfect metaphor for human suffering. Endless effort, endless struggle. No final victory, no ultimate reward, just repetition. But Camus looked at the story differently. He imagined the moment when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain to retrieve the rock again. A moment of awareness. A moment when Sisyphus fully understands his situation. He knows the struggle will never end. He knows the task has no final meaning. And yet, He continues. This is where Camus made his most famous and surprising conclusion. He wrote, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy. At first, that sounds strange. How could someone trapped in an endless, meaningless struggle possibly be happy?" Camus' answer is surprisingly simple, because the moment Sisyphus accepts the absurd, the gods lose their power over him. His struggle becomes his choice. The act of pushing the rock becomes an expression of defiance, a refusal to surrender to meaninglessness, and in that defiance, Sisyphus becomes free. In many ways, this story mirrors the human condition. We are born into a universe that does not explain itself. We struggle. We work. We search for meaning. But the difference between despair and freedom lies in how we respond. If you demand that life must provide meaning before you can live fully, you may spend your entire life waiting. But if you accept the absurd, if you recognize that meaning is not given but created, then the struggle itself becomes something different. It becomes an opportunity, an experience, a canvas on which you create your own story. This is the rebellion Camus believed every person has the power to choose. Not rebellion against life, but rebellion for life. Living deeply, experiencing intensely, choosing meaning even in a silent universe. And once you understand this idea, something surprising begins to happen. The philosophy of the absurd stops being abstract. It starts transforming the way you actually live your life. How this philosophy changes your life. At first, the philosophy of Albert Camus sounds like something purely intellectual, an interesting idea discussed by philosophers, something to think about, but not something that affects everyday life. But once a person truly understands the absurd, it begins to change the way they see almost everything. Because when you stop believing that life must follow a predetermined script, many of the invisible pressures that once controlled you start to lose their power. For example, think about how many people live their lives seeking validation. They want approval from society, approval from strangers. Online, they measure their worth through achievements, status, recognition. But once you accept that the universe itself does not assign value to these things, something interesting happens. You realize that many of these pressures were never absolute truths. They were social expectations, stories people collectively agreed to believe. And when you see that clearly, you gain the ability to step outside those expectations. This doesn't mean you stop working. It doesn't mean you stop pursuing goals, but the reason you pursue them begins to change. Instead of chasing success because you believe it will finally give your life meaning, you pursue things because they genuinely interest you, because they excite your curiosity, because they allow you to experience life more deeply. In other words, you stop living for external validation and start living for authentic experience. Another powerful shift happens around the idea of failure. Many people are paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice. They worry about choosing the wrong career, the wrong opportunity, the wrong path in life. They fear wasting their potential. But if life has no predetermined meaning, then there was never a single correct path waiting for you. There are only different experiences, different stories you can create. Failure stops being a catastrophic event. It becomes part of exploration, part of learning, part of the human experience itself. The same shift happens with comparison. Modern culture constantly encourages people to compare their lives with others. Who has more success, more wealth, more recognition, more achievements? But when you recognize that meaning is something each person creates individually, comparison starts to lose its relevance. Someone else's path has nothing to do with yours. Their story does not define the value of your own. And this realization can create something rare in the modern world, a sense of psychological freedom. You begin to focus less on proving something to others and more on experiencing life honestly. You might pursue creative passions. You might explore ideas that genuinely interest you. You might build relationships that feel meaningful rather than impressive. You might simply become more present in the moments you experience. Because when meaning is no longer something you are desperately trying to find, life itself becomes the place where meaning is created. In small actions, in curiosity, in connection, in the simple decision to live fully despite uncertainty. This is what Albert Camus ultimately believed. The absurd does not destroy life. It removes illusions that once limited how deeply we could experience it. And once those illusions fall away, something surprising becomes visible. The hidden gift inside meaninglessness itself. At the beginning of this video, we explored a disturbing idea, the possibility that life might have no inherent meaning. For many people, that thought feels heavy, almost unbearable, because we grow up believing that somewhere out there must be a clear answer, a grand purpose, a final explanation, a reason that makes everything make sense. But Albert Camus believed that searching for this ultimate answer can trap people in an endless struggle, a struggle that often leads to disappointment, because the universe may never give us the explanation we expect. But here is the strange paradox Camus wanted us to understand. When life has no predetermined meaning, something remarkable happens. Nothing is already decided. No path is permanently assigned to you. No destiny controls the direction of your life, which means something incredibly powerful. Your story is still unwritten. Every decision you make matters. Every action becomes an act of creation. Every experience becomes part of the meaning you build for yourself. Instead of discovering purpose like a hidden treasure, you create it, moment by moment, choice by choice. This is why Camus did not see the absurd as something tragic. He saw it as something liberating. Because once you stop expecting the universe to justify your existence, you are finally free to live, free to explore, free to create meaning in your own way, free to experience life without waiting for cosmic permission. And this is where the story of Sisyphus becomes symbolic again. The rock may never stay at the top of the mountain. The struggle may never completely disappear. Life will still include uncertainty, effort, and moments of difficulty. But within that struggle lies something deeply human. The ability to continue anyway, to laugh, to explore, to love, to build, to experience the world with curiosity, even in a silent universe. Camus believed that the moment a person truly accepts the absurd, they stop asking life for permission to exist. They simply begin living, and perhaps that is the deepest insight of all. Maybe the universe never gave you a fixed purpose, because it left the canvas blank, so you could paint something that had never existed before. Your life, your choices, your meaning. And maybe the real question was never, what is the meaning of life? Maybe the real question is something much more personal. What meaning will you choose to create?